The cabin buzzed with quiet anticipation as the Jacobs family settled into their seats, their excitement barely contained. Sophia Jacobs smiled gently as she adjusted her daughter Lily's seatbelt, brushing a curl from the little girl's forehead with a mother's tenderness. Her husband Marcus reached for the in-flight magazine, flipping through it idly, though his thoughts were clearly on the tropical vacation ahead. Across the aisle, their 10-year-old son Jordan pressed his forehead to the window, watching the ground crew load bags onto the plane, a look of wonder lighting up his face. They had been planning this family trip for over a year, saved for it, dreamed about it. It was meant to be a time of rest, connection, and joy. But within minutes, that dream began to unravel, thread by thread. The mood shifted when a shadow loomed over them. Sophia looked up, expecting to see a smiling attendant ready to offer a warm welcome. Instead, she was met with the stern face of a woman in a perfectly pressed uniform, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her name tag read Brenda Shaw. But it wasn't her name that unsettled Sophia. It was the coldness in her eyes, the stiffness in her posture, the way she looked down at them, not with concern, but with suspicion. "May I see your tickets?" Brenda asked sharply, her tone clipped and without the courtesy usually offered to passengers. Sophia blinked, momentarily confused. They had already been through the gate check. The flight attendant at the door had smiled and welcomed them aboard. Everything had gone smoothly. Still, she reached into her purse, retrieving the printed tickets and handing them over with a polite, if hesitant, smile. Brenda took them with a snap, scanning them as if she were searching for something wrong. Her lips tightened. "These seats are in premium economy," she said coolly. "This section is reserved for premium passengers." "Yes," Sophia said carefully, feeling the air grow heavier. "That's what we booked. Premium economy." Brenda didn't even look up. "You'll need to move. These seats aren't yours." Marcus's brows furrowed as he leaned forward. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "We paid for these seats. We confirmed our upgrade. We're in the right place." Brenda handed the tickets back without so much as a glance. "You'll have to move to the back," she repeated, her voice edged with finality. Around them, heads began to turn. A few passengers glanced over, while others made a point to look away. No one said anything. Not yet. Jordan looked up from his window seat, eyes wide, confusion wrinkling his brow. "Why do we have to move, Mom?" he asked quietly. Sophia felt her stomach twist, the knot of humiliation tightening. She kept her tone even for her children's sake. "Is there a problem with our tickets?" she asked Brenda, searching for some logical explanation. Brenda's lips pressed into a line. "I don't know how you got these," she said under her breath, her words dripping with doubt. "But these seats are meant for premium customers." Marcus sat straighter. "We are premium customers," he said, trying to stay composed. "We paid for this. We have receipts, boarding passes." Brenda didn't budge. Her voice snapped like a whip. "I need you to move now or I'll have to call security." The words rang out with a chill that silenced the surrounding rows. Jordan's small hands gripped the armrests. Sophia's heart pounded, blood rushing in her ears. She felt exposed, humiliated, as if the very fabric of her family's dignity had been ripped apart in front of strangers who said nothing, did nothing. She reached for her bag, her hands trembling. "Come on," she said softly to the kids, willing herself not to cry. "We're going to our new seats." Jordan opened his mouth as if to protest again, but his mother's look, filled with quiet pain and resolve, stopped him. Marcus's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck tight as he stood. Together, the Jacobs family gathered their belongings and began the long walk to the back of the plane. They passed row after row of watching eyes, some wide with discomfort, others narrowed in curiosity. But no one intervened, no one spoke up for them. That silence echoed louder than Brenda's voice had. It screamed a message Jordan would never forget. You don't belong. At the back of the plane, Sophia helped Lily into a cramped seat near the restrooms. The air back here felt stuffier, the space tighter, the dream more distant than ever. She sat with her straight back, holding her daughter's hand, trying to shield her from the invisible weight pressing down on them. Marcus remained standing for a moment, his eyes scanning the cabin as if still trying to make sense of what had happened. "This isn't right," he muttered. "I know," Sophia said softly. But she wasn't just talking about the seating anymore. Something deeper had been shattered. It wasn't just their vacation that had been disrupted. It was their trust in fairness, in respect, in the belief that following the rules would protect them from this kind of treatment. And worst of all, their children had seen it happen. In that moment, something inside Sophia hardened. Not into anger, but into clarity. They hadn't been asked to move because of a mistake in the system. They had been moved because someone had looked at them and decided they didn't belong. Without checking, without questioning, without care. And the worst part? It had happened before. Subtly, quietly. But this time, it had happened in front of 100 silent witnesses. It was blatant, and she would not let it slide. Not for her children, not for herself. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a message. A message delivered without words, but heard loud and clear by every passenger who watched the Jacobs family stand up, shoulders stiff, heads held high, and shuffle slowly toward the back of the plane as if they were being punished for existing in the wrong place. Brenda Shaw hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't said anything overt, but it was there in her tone, in the way she narrowed her eyes at them, in the disgust she barely disguised. She didn't see Sophia and Marcus Jacobs as parents on a family vacation. She didn't see Jordan as a bright-eyed child eager for a new adventure. She didn't see Lily as a giggling little girl, bouncing in her seat with innocent joy. No, she saw something else, something she didn't trust, something she believed didn't belong, and she didn't need to explain herself, not to the family she displaced, not to the passengers who watched, and certainly not to herself. Because people like Brenda didn't think they were biased. They thought they were just doing their jobs. They thought they were upholding standards. But in reality, they were enforcing a deeper, uglier truth that sometimes skin color speaks louder than a boarding pass. The most chilling part wasn't even what Brenda said. It was what everyone else didn't. Because when the Jacobs family was told to move, no one stood up. Not the man in the suit in row 8 who looked away and pretended to be reading. Not the elderly couple in row 10 who whispered but did nothing. Not the mother in row 12 who frowned but quickly turned to comfort her own child. Eyes darted away, heads dipped, mouths stayed shut, and in that silence, heavy, suffocating, deliberate, was the second betrayal. A silent pact to not get involved, to not disrupt their own comfort by defending someone else's dignity. The Jacobs didn't just walk down the aisle, they carried the weight of 100 people's quiet cowardice. And behind them trailed something heavier than luggage. Humiliation, grief, and the sting of knowing your presence alone was seen as a problem. But what Brenda didn't know, what no one knew at the time, was that someone important was watching. Someone who wasn't just a passenger, but a man with the power to shake the very foundation of the airline that had so easily dismissed a paying family. His name was Malcolm Pierce, and he sat in 1A, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, silent, composed, and nearly invisible. He had watched every second of the interaction unfold. Not with curiosity, not with pity, but with a quiet fury that had been growing for years, fed by moments like these. Moments that were all too familiar. Malcolm had worked his way up from baggage handler to executive vice president. He had seen the back-end policies, the internal memos about customer service, the trainings that claimed to focus on inclusion and respect. And yet, here it was, the truth, laid bare. No policy could hide it. No HR workshop could mask it. Because Brenda hadn't made a mistake based on confusion, she had made a decision based on assumption. She had looked at the Jacobs family and decided they didn't belong. And in that moment, every smile she had given to passengers who looked the part, every nod she reserved only for those who met her internal checklist of premium worthy one, was exposed. It wasn't about seats, it was about power. The power to humiliate, the power to shame, the power to reduce a family to silence with nothing more than a pointed look and a condescending tone. That power had protected her for years, and until now it had never failed her. But she didn't know that her reign, her illusion of control, was about to end in a way that would shake not just her world, but the entire plane. Because Malcolm Pierce didn't just watch. He picked up his phone. He dialed a number. And in a voice calm as ice and sharp as steel, he said, "We have a situation on Flight 802. I want it handled. Immediately." And as Sophia sat in that cramped, noisy seat near the restrooms, holding Lily close, pretending everything was fine, she didn't know that justice had already begun moving toward her, quietly, swiftly, and inevitably. Because what Brenda didn't understand, what the passengers around them didn't seem to grasp, was that these moments don't just fade. They don't disappear when the flight lands. They linger in memories, in children's hearts. In the hollow ache of being wronged in public and left to carry the burden alone, Jordan would never forget the moment he looked at his mother and asked, "Why do we have to move?" And how she had no answer, how she had smiled for his sake, even though her heart was breaking. That wound wouldn't heal easily, not with apologies, not with vouchers or credits or hollow reassurances. Because discrimination doesn't just live in hate. It thrives in silence, in systems, in the tired, exhausted eyes of people who have been told one too many times, "You don't belong here." But that night, something different was coming. Something Brenda wouldn't see until it was far too late. Because her mistake, her bias, had chosen the wrong family at the wrong time. And while she strutted through the aisles pretending nothing had happened, the storm was already forming. The phone calls were being made. The manifest was being checked. Her actions were being reviewed. And this time, the world would not look away. This time, the silence would shatter. And the people who had said nothing, who had turned their heads, would have to confront what they let happen. So if you've ever stayed silent when you saw something wrong, if you've ever looked away instead of speaking up, if you've ever told yourself it wasn't your place or your problem, listen closely. Because this isn't just a story about a family on a plane. It's about every place where power and prejudice collide. It's about every child who's learned too soon what injustice feels like. And it's about what happens when the world finally watches back. Keep listening, because Brenda's reckoning hasn't even begun. Leon Mercer sat in seat 1A, legs crossed, hands resting gently on the polished leather armrest, his eyes flicking across the cabin with a practiced calm. He wasn't a man easily startled. As the executive vice president of global flight operations, he had seen his share of emergencies, weather delays, customer outbursts, mechanical scares. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. From the moment the Jacobs family boarded, Leon had noticed their warmth, the way Sophia gently fastened her daughter's seatbelt, the soft nod Marcus gave to every passing passenger, the wonder on little Jordan's face as he peered out the window. They reminded him of his own family, especially his late wife, Adrienne, who had passed just 2 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. She had been the heart of their home, the reason he'd found meaning beyond spreadsheets and jet fuel. Watching the Jacobs quietly prepare for takeoff brought a sudden, unexpected ache to Leon's chest. He missed those days. The family trips, the anticipation, the way Adrienne used to calm their boys with just a look. But then the moment shattered. He had caught the sudden shift in the air, the way passengers instinctively quieted, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but tension. He turned slightly in his seat and saw her, Brenda Shaw, the lead flight attendant, standing rigid over the Jacobs family. Her tone, sharp as glass, carried through the cabin. "You need to move now," she had said. No warmth, no courtesy, just icy command. Leon's brow furrowed. Something was wrong. He saw Marcus hold up their tickets, saw the confusion on Sophia's face, the worry in Jordan's eyes. Leon had read enough people in his lifetime to know the difference between someone trying to game the system and someone simply stunned by injustice. These people didn't deserve this, and yet they were being herded like they'd broken some unwritten rule, like they weren't welcome, and no one was saying a word. Leon's gut twisted with something raw. He'd seen it before far too many times. The quiet ways people get pushed aside, and the loud ways they're silenced. But this wasn't just any flight. This wasn't just any family. And Brenda's mistake wasn't just one of judgment, it was one of timing. Leon Mercer was not a man who took his authority lightly. In fact, it was something he rarely exercised in public. He didn't wear his title like armor. He didn't need to. People respected him because he listened, because he paid attention to things others missed, like the tremble in Sophia's hands as she reached for her bag, like the quiet rage on Marcus's face, barely held back for the sake of his kids. like the heartbreak in Jordan's voice when he asked, "Why do we have to move?" Those were things Leon couldn't unsee. But what cut deepest was what he saw in Brenda's eyes. Certainty. The certainty of someone who had done this before, who had never been challenged, who believed, truly believed, that she was in the right, that she could humiliate an entire family and be met with silence. Not today. Leon reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. But just as he prepared to make the call, a voice crackled overhead. The flight intercom. Brenda's voice, falsely cheery now, echoed through the plane as she began pre-flight announcements, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just shoved a family's dignity into the cargo hold with their luggage. His finger hovered over the screen, but he paused, not out of hesitation, but because something else caught his attention. From across the aisle, a young woman in a blue sundress, row 3C, leaned over slightly toward her seatmate and whispered, "I saw the same thing happen to my parents once. They didn't even get an apology." She said it quietly, almost to herself. But it hit Leon like a gut punch. This wasn't rare. It wasn't an accident. It was part of a pattern. And suddenly, he wasn't in first class anymore. He was 17 again, sitting next to his mother on a long flight to Chicago. She had saved for months to afford that trip, 2 tickets in the main cabin, and an upgrade to economy, plus thanks to her corporate discount. Leon still remembered the way the attendant had stared at them when they boarded, the way she double-checked their boarding passes 3 times and then muttered under her breath, "You sure these aren't counterfeit?" He remembered the shame on his mother's face, the way she smiled and said nothing. He had buried that moment, pushed it down like so many others. But today, watching history repeat itself, something in him broke. He tapped the screen and called direct. "It's Mercer, Flight 802. We've got a problem. A family was just removed from their upgraded seats without cause. I want it handled. Immediately. Full protocol." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. On the other end, silence answered for a beat, then, "Understood, Mr. Mercer. Beginning verification now." Leon ended the call and stared ahead, jaw tight. Brenda was already serving drinks in first class, smiling politely, none the wiser. She didn't know the walls were closing in. She didn't know that the man she had passed earlier, whose water she had filled with mechanical cheer, held more power than she could imagine. And she certainly didn't know that her actions had triggered a reckoning. But she would. Leon sat back in his seat, watching this cabin, his heart pounding. Not with anger, but resolve. Because what had happened wasn't just wrong, it was personal. And this time there would be accountability. Not just for the Jacobs family, not just for every passenger who watched in silence, but for every child like Jordan, every mother like Sophia, every husband like Marcus, who had ever been told without words, "You don't belong here." Leon wasn't just going to fix it. He was going to make sure it never happened again. The chime of the cockpit phone rang like a warning bell through the quiet hum of the cabin, its crisp tone cutting through Olivia Shaw's meticulously built composure. She had just finished topping off a passenger's coffee in first class, her smile practiced, her demeanor calm. But when the lead attendant at the front whispered that the captain needed her immediately, something sharp curled in her gut. She didn't know yet what was waiting behind that door. Didn't know that the next 7 minutes would redefine everything she believed about herself, her job, her authority. She smoothed the front of her uniform, checked her reflection in the galley's brushed steel, and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. Passengers glanced up as she passed, their gazes tinged with curiosity or cold disinterest. No one knew what was coming, not yet. She knocked once and stepped into the cockpit. The doors sealed shut behind her with a muted click, sealing her off from the world she'd ruled for years. Inside, the air was different. Thick, weighted. Captain Mitchell sat with both hands calmly resting on the controls, his jaw set. First Officer Delgado didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the flight instruments, but Olivia could see the tension in his posture. And then she noticed the screen. A small display on the control panel, flickering to life with the image of a man she recognized instantly. Ethan Caldwell, the Vice President of Operations. His face filled the screen, sharp eyes unreadable, his posture rigid with precision. Not anger, not concern, just intent. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "Miss Shaw," Ethan said, his voice smooth and cold as steel. We need to discuss the events that just occurred in your cabin. Her pulse surged. She stood a little straighter, still trying to regain the control she always held. Of course, sir, she said. Is there a specific issue? Ethan didn't blink. A family was removed from premium economy under your orders. Please explain why. For a moment, Olivia's mouth went dry. She scrambled to replay the events in her mind, reaching for the protocol she thought she'd followed. There seemed to be a discrepancy with their tickets, she said carefully. They were sitting in seats reserved for premium passengers, but their demeanor and, well, it just didn't add up. Ethan's brows rose just slightly, but the judgment in his eyes was thunderous. Their demeanor? He asked. You removed them based on demeanor? No, she snapped too quickly, then softened her tone. I meant the tickets looked off. I thought they'd been upgraded in error. I've handled situations like this before. Did you verify that with the gate agent? Ethan asked. Silence. Did you check the passenger manifest before making the move? Another pause. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Captain Mitchell spoke for the first time, his tone low but clear. Miss Shaw, I pulled up the manifest when I heard about the situation. The Jacobs family's tickets were valid. Their upgrade was approved. You removed a paying family from the seats they were assigned without verifying a single detail. The words slammed into her like a sudden drop in altitude. She staggered internally, trying to balance her pride with the unmistakable truth. I didn't mean to cause any harm, she said, her voice now a whisper. I was just following. No, Ethan cut her off. You weren't following protocol. You were following your own assumptions. Those words, your own assumptions, hung in the air like a sentence. And for the first time in years, Olivia felt something she didn't recognize. Fear, real, chest-tightening, future-ending fear. Her hands began to tremble slightly. Her voice cracked. I didn't realize that. I didn't think. No, Ethan interrupted again, firmer now. You didn't think, and that's the problem. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Ethan leaned forward on the screen, his face inches closer, and his voice dropped with a finality that made Olivia's breath stall. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. You will not engage with passengers. You will not work this cabin. You will remain in the crew area until landing. Do you understand? Her lips parted, but nothing came out. She could feel her entire foundation shaking. Her authority, her seniority, her identity, stripped away in real time. Captain Mitchell stood slowly and handed her a printed directive. This is not a conversation anymore. This is policy. And just like that, the power she had clung to for so long dissolved into vapor. Olivia Shaw, who had once controlled the tone and tempo of the cabin, who had silenced passengers with a single glance, now stood frozen, breathless, stripped of the very uniform that once made her feel untouchable. As she turned to exit the cockpit, her steps were no longer confident. They were hollow, measured. She could feel the sting of judgment before she had even re-entered the cabin. The moment she stepped through that door, the whispers began. She was no longer the respected flight attendant. She was the cautionary tale. And as she disappeared into the crew area, shaking, silent, alone, you listening now need to have a choice. You can watch her fall and scroll away, or you can pause and look at the truth of what happened. Because Olivia's downfall isn't just about one flight. It's about the way unchecked authority can cause irreparable harm. It's about how easy it is to mistake control for justice. It's about the price of assumptions and the silent courage it takes to challenge them. So if you believe that accountability matters, if you believe that every family deserves to fly without shame, if you believe that silence is complicity, like this story, share it, speak up, because this time someone watched. This time someone did something. But how many flights have landed where no one did? Don't let this be just another story that disappears with the landing gear. Let it be a turning point. The air inside the cabin had grown still, not quiet, but still, like the eerie calm before a thunderstorm cracks open the sky. Passengers who had been halfway through movies, casually sipping drinks or flipping pages of their novels, now found their focus drifting, conversations fading, attention turning towards something they couldn't quite name but instinctively knew was coming. And then it happened. The crackle of the intercom overhead, soft at first, then louder, more commanding. Captain Mitchell's voice rang out, steady and composed, but edged with something few passengers had ever heard on a flight. Resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking, he began, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. Olivia Shaw sat frozen in the crew area, her palms slick with sweat, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. She knew this wasn't the usual turbulence update. This wasn't a routine announcement. This was about her, about what she had done. And now the truth was about to land before the plane ever did. I'd like to take a moment to address a situation that occurred earlier in this flight, the captain continued. There was an error in seating, and as a result, a family was wrongly removed from their assigned seats in premium economy. Instantly, a wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin like a rising tide. Heads turned, passengers whispered behind hands, some gasped softly. Others, those who had watched the incident unfold, felt their stomachs twist with guilt. They had seen it. They had said nothing. They had looked away. But now the story wasn't being buried beneath silence. It was being brought into the light. The airline deeply regrets this mistake, the captain said, his voice unwavering. And I would like to personally thank Mr. Leon Mercer for bringing this matter to our attention so we could ensure it is properly addressed. Olivia felt her face flush with heat, her ears ringing. She had never been publicly corrected, not once in all her years flying. The rules had always protected her. Her rank had always shielded her. But now the entire cabin knew. They all knew, and worse, they were looking. Row after row of eyes turned, not toward the cockpit, but toward the galley, toward where she was hiding, curled behind the curtain like a child who had been scolded in front of the class. Back in the last row of economy, Sophia Jacobs blinked. Her daughter Lily had fallen asleep on her shoulder, breathing softly, unaware of the moment's weight. Her son Jordan, however, lifted his head, wide-eyed. "Mama," he whispered, "are they talking about us?" Sophia didn't answer with words. She just squeezed his hand and let a soft smile touch her lips. Because yes, finally yes, they were. Meanwhile, Marcus Jacobs sat still, his fingers folded together, eyes forward, listening. For the first time since being told to move, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, heard. Not entirely vindicated, no apology could undo the public shame they had endured. But this was a start, and that's when it happened. From his seat in the rear cabin, Marcus calmly unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Not loudly, not to make a scene, but because the silence had stretched too far, and someone needed to speak. His voice was even, strong, but laced with undeniable pain. "That apology should be given to us," he said clearly, "not just the passengers." The entire plane froze. The whispering stopped. Forks hovered midair. Fingers paused on phone screens. All attention shifted. Because he was right. The airline had acknowledged the error. The captain had admitted the mistake. But Olivia, the person who had wielded her authority like a weapon, had said nothing. Sophia looked up at her husband, her heart aching with pride. She didn't stop him. She didn't need to. This wasn't confrontation. This was truth. Passengers began to murmur again, but this time their tone had changed. A woman in 14B whispered, "He's right." A man in 22F crossed his arms and nodded solemnly. The tide had turned. And Olivia? She stood on the other side of the curtain, trembling. She had never felt this exposed in her life. She had silenced people for years with her authority, her calm voice, her command of the cabin. But now she was the one being judged. Not by executives, not by policy, but by the very people she had once dismissed. Her feet refused to move. Her voice caught in her throat. But the pressure built with every second she stayed silent. Finally, she stepped forward. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tightly, and every pair of eyes in that cabin turned to her like a spotlight. She opened her mouth. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, trying to summon her usual poise. But it was gone. "I want to apologize," she said quietly, "to the Jacobs family for what I did." No one clapped, no one smiled. They listened. "I was wrong," she continued. I made assumptions. I acted before I verified. I treated you as if you didn't belong. And I humiliated you in front of everyone. And I'm sorry. Her voice trembled at the end, but it was real. And for the first time on that flight, Olivia didn't sound like a flight attendant. She sounded like a human being. Marcus slowly sat down. Sophia nodded. And Jordan? Jordan whispered. She said sorry. Passengers nodded. A few even murmured soft approval. But this story isn't just about what Olivia said or didn't say. It's about what you do next. Because too often these moments happen in silence. In shadows, they get swept under the rug, buried beneath apologies that never come, or ones whispered when no one's listening. But you are sure listening. So if you believe Marcus was right to speak up, if you believe Sophia deserved to be treated with respect, if you believe Jordan should have never had to ask why his family was moved, comment below. Leave a word of encouragement. Let the Jacobs family know they weren't alone. That someone, somewhere, heard their story and cared. And if you've ever seen someone wronged and said nothing, let this be your wake-up call. Because when passengers stay silent, injustice flies first class. But when someone speaks up, change finally has a seat on the plane. And that's something worth landing on. At first, it had been quiet, not peaceful, never peaceful, but quiet in that painful, heavy way silence falls after something wrong has happened and no one knows what to say. Passengers had watched the Jacobs family be forced from their premium seats to the back of the plane with little more than a stiff directive and a tight-lipped glare. No yelling, no resistance, just confusion, heartbreak, and humiliation wrapped in composure for the sake of two young children who didn't yet understand the weight of what was happening. And while everyone saw it, no one said a word, not in that moment. Because in that moment, silence felt safer, inaction was easier. But now, after the captain's public announcement and the flight attendant's reluctant apology, the stillness had broken. And from the back of the plane, where they had been wrongfully sent, Marcus Jacobs' voice rose. Not in anger, but in quiet, measured truth that sliced through the cabin like a scalpel. That apology should be given to us, not just the passengers. It was a sentence so calm, so steady, it landed louder than any shouting ever could. The effect was instant. A ripple of discomfort spread through the rows. People shifted in their seats. Phones lowered. Conversations halted, because suddenly the passengers were no longer just witnesses to someone else's pain. They were part of it, complicit in it. And now the man who had been dismissed and displaced was standing, not to yell, not to demand, but simply to be seen. And in his voice, there was something that couldn't be ignored, the quiet dignity of someone who had been dehumanized and was still asking for respect. Sophia reached for his hand, their fingers interlocking. Jordan watched his father with wide, searching eyes, sensing the weight of the moment, even if he couldn't yet name it. Lily stirred but remained curled into her mother's side, the innocence of her dreams undisturbed for now. But the rest of the plane? They weren't dreaming anymore. In row 14B, a woman who had tweeted about the incident now sat with her arms folded tightly, her eyes narrowed at the front of the plane where Olivia Shaw stood, still reeling from the backlash. The woman whispered to her seatmate, "He's right. She said sorry, but she didn't mean it. She just wanted it to be over." In 22F, a man who had kept his head down during the confrontation now stared forward, guilt eating at him. He'd seen it happen. He'd watched the way Olivia had looked at the Jacobs family, the way she hadn't asked anyone else for their tickets, hadn't even questioned the others in premium economy. He had known something felt wrong, but he had chosen to stay quiet. Now he couldn't. One by one, the mood began to shift. What was once an uncomfortable hush turned into a rising tide of emotion. Not rage, something deeper, a collective reckoning. Eyes turned to Olivia not with curiosity but with expectation. They were waiting for more than a canned apology, waiting for something real. Olivia, still standing near the galley, felt the walls closing in. Her hands trembled at her sides, the weight of every gaze pressing down on her, every unspoken judgment louder than the captain's intercom. She had thought the worst was over when she was stripped of her duties. But this moment was worse, because now she couldn't hide behind her uniform or procedure or rank. Now she had to face what she had done, not in a disciplinary hearing, not in a manager's office, but here, on this plane, in front of every person she had once served. And then the murmurs began. From row after row, soft voices rose like echoes, faint at first, then unmistakable. Why didn't she check first? They looked so confused. How could she think they were lying? I should have said something. I should have stood up. It wasn't just sympathy, it was sorrow, it was shame. For every moment of complicity, for every time they had looked away. And Olivia heard it all. She heard the unraveling of the trust she had once carried in her stride. She heard her reputation, her years of seniority, crumble under the weight of a truth she had tried to deny. But still, Marcus stood, not gloating, not angry, just waiting, waiting for her to see him, really see him. And in that moment, Olivia looked down the aisle and met his eyes. What she saw there wasn't fury. It wasn't hatred. It was worse. It was disappointment. The kind that reaches inside you and pulls out the truth you've been trying to bury. She wanted to look away, wanted to disappear, but she couldn't, because he was still standing, and so was the truth. I humiliated your family, Olivia finally said, her voice soft but raw. I assumed things that I had no right to assume. I was wrong. I didn't just remove you from your seats. I stripped you of your dignity, and I'm sorry. The cabin went silent again, but not the suffocating silence from before. This silence was different. It was the kind that comes just after something real has been said, something that matters. Sophia nodded, her jaw tight. Marcus finally sat, not because the apology erased what happened, but because it acknowledged it. And Jordan, he whispered, "Thank you, Dad," and leaned his head against his father's arm. This story isn't just about a flight. It's not just about seating arrangements or apologies. It's about what happens when the people who see wrong finally choose to speak up. When silence becomes courage. When bystanders become voices. When dignity is demanded, not with fists, but with truth. So if you're still listening, really listening, tell us what you would have done. Comment below. Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have spoken like Marcus did? Let the Jacobs family know they were seen. That someone, somewhere heard their story and felt it. Because the world doesn't change when policies are written. It changes when we do. And maybe, this time, someone will finally stand before it's too late. There's a moment when you've lost control of a room, when silence becomes louder than any scream. Olivia Shaw stood in the narrow aisle near the front of the cabin, her once confident posture reduced to trembling shoulders and clenched fists. For over a decade, she had walked these rows with authority, her crisp uniform and precise smile enough to command respect. She had trained new recruits, de-escalated passenger complaints, and been commended for her leadership more times than she could count. But now none of that mattered. None of it shielded her from the weight of what she had done, or the eyes that watched her now, no longer with admiration, but with judgment. The apology was not optional. The quiet voice from the back of the plane, Marcus Jacobs, had made sure of that. "You humiliated us in front of everyone," he had said, voice calm but unshakable. "You should apologize in front of everyone, too." The cabin had gone dead silent in response, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. And Olivia knew deep in her gut that this wasn't going to be something she could talk her way out of. She had already tried once, a feeble attempt, trembling and vague. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she had muttered earlier, her voice barely carrying past row 3. But it wasn't enough, not for Marcus, not for Sophia, not for their children, and not for the passengers who had seen it all and said nothing. "That's not an apology," Sophia had said, her voice steady and clear. "You didn't inconvenience us. You embarrassed us. You judged us. You took our seats, our dignity, and dismissed us like we didn't belong." Those words echoed now in Olivia's ears, louder than the engine's roar, louder than the whispers still lingering throughout the plane. She looked out across the rows and saw faces turn toward her. Dozens of passengers watching not as travelers, but as witnesses. She swallowed hard and took a shaky step forward, heart pounding in her chest like a drum out of rhythm. Her throat felt tight, her hands clammy. This wasn't turbulence. This was free fall. She began and then faltered. Her voice cracked. She looked down, then back up, forcing herself to meet Marcus's eyes. He didn't glare. He didn't look angry. Somehow that was worse. There was no fire in his expression, only calm, disappointed expectation. And Olivia, who had spent her entire career being in charge, felt smaller than she ever had before. "I was wrong," she said again, her voice steadier this time. "I was wrong to question your family's place. I didn't check. I didn't verify. I made assumptions based on how you looked, on how I felt, and I let that guide my decision. That was not policy. That was prejudice, and it was mine." The cabin remained silent, not cold, not tense, just still, listening. "I humiliated you," Olivia continued, her voice trembling at the edges, "in front of your children, in front of everyone. I stripped you of your dignity, and I did it because I thought I was doing my job. But the truth is, I was protecting a bias I didn't even want to admit I had." In the back of the plane, Sophia blinked slowly, her jaw tightening. She had heard empty apologies before. This one didn't feel empty. Jordan looked up from his seat, wide-eyed. He clutched his backpack tightly, then loosened his grip just slightly. For the first time, he saw the woman who had treated his family like they didn't matter, looking like she might finally understand that they did. Olivia's voice broke as she continued. "I've spent years believing that following procedure made me fair. That experience made me right. But all that time, I was missing something more important: empathy, humanity. And because of that, I hurt your family in a way that no refund, no flight credit, no upgrade can fix." She paused, exhaling shakily. Her eyes glistened now, but she didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said, the words raw, unpolished, but real. "Not for the inconvenience, not for the drama, for the pain I caused, for the damage I did, and for every second you felt like you didn't belong on this flight, because you did. You absolutely did." Marcus didn't speak. He simply nodded once, slowly acknowledging the apology. Not forgiving it, not forgetting, but recognizing it for what it was: a beginning. Behind Olivia, a few passengers began to shift. In a 14B, the woman who had tweeted the moment the Jacobs were displaced lowered her phone slowly and gave a small, approving nod. In 22F, the man who had said nothing earlier now leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression solemn, reflective. In a few places, you could hear someone inhale a little deeper, exhale a little slower. It wasn't applause, it wasn't celebration. It was recognition. Because everyone on that plane had seen the wrong, and now they had seen what it looked like to finally, publicly own it. But this isn't just about Olivia, and it's not just about the Jacobs family. It's about you, listening now. Because somewhere in your life, at work, in school, at the grocery store, you may have seen something like this. Maybe you spoke up. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you were like Olivia once, convinced you were right because the rules said so, because no one had ever challenged you to ask why you felt what you felt. Or maybe you were like Marcus, calm, quiet, but unyielding. Someone who held up the mirror, even when the person on the other side didn't want to look. So now we ask you, comment below. If you felt something shift inside you, let us know. If you believe Marcus was brave, tell him. If you've ever been Olivia and learned the hard way, share your story. Because accountability doesn't end in an aisle at 30,000 feet. It begins there. It begins when we stop pretending that following procedure excuses ignoring people's humanity. It begins when someone says, "I was wrong," and it grows stronger when others respond, "I hear you. I believe in better." This flight isn't just a story, it's a reminder that dignity can be taken in seconds. But it can only be restored when someone finally decides to do the hard thing and mean it. The moment the wheels touched down, Olivia Shaw felt her heart drop faster than the plane could brake. It wasn't the sudden jolt of the landing that made her stomach twist. It was the understanding that the real crash was still coming. She sat in the jump seat near the galley, her hands clenched together, staring at the floor as the plane slowed and taxied toward the gate. She had been a flight attendant for over 14 years. She had ridden out turbulence, soothed crying babies, kept her cool during medical emergencies, and calmed panicking passengers in the middle of the storms. But nothing, not training, not experience, not even the layers of professionalism she'd spent years cultivating, could have prepared her for the moment when she would become the headline. She hadn't spoken since her apology, not to a single crew member, not even to herself. Her voice had cracked open in that aisle like a wound, and since then, she'd felt hollow. The words had been real. She had meant them. But even in her sincerity, she knew the apology didn't erase what had happened. Not the stares, not the silence that had followed the incident, not the humiliation she had laid across the Jacobs family like a weighted blanket. And as the plane came to a final stop at the gate, the intercom crackled once more. Captain Mitchell's voice, no longer warm, but procedural. Flight attendants, prepare for arrival. This was it. Olivia unfastened her harness slowly, her fingers stiff and cold. She stood, barely able to keep her legs from shaking. As the other crew members began moving to assist passengers with disembarking, she stood still, frozen in place like a statue of shame. The curtain to the first-class cabin remained half-drawn, but even through that narrow slit, she could see the passengers gathering their belongings, some sneaking glances in her direction, others whispering behind cupped hands. Her presence had become a spectacle. And then she saw him, the security officer. He stepped through the jet bridge and into the open cabin door, his dark uniform and stoic expression enough to stop several passengers mid-motion. A few gasped softly. Others began raising their phones. Olivia's mouth went dry. She had expected an email, a suspension notice, a private meeting with HR when they landed. Not this, not an escort, not in front of everyone. He walked slowly but directly to her. "Miss Shaw," he said quietly but firmly, "you need to come with me." She nodded, but her lips trembled. "Yes, yes, sir," she whispered. The officer didn't grab her, didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. The entire cabin was already watching. The whispering turned to murmurs. "Is that her? Wait, they're escorting her off? Oh my God, this is real." Phones were filming. Olivia knew that footage of her walking down this aisle, once her kingdom, would be uploaded within minutes. The camera wouldn't capture the years she had poured into this job. It wouldn't show the countless families she had helped, the passengers she'd comforted, the chaos she'd once controlled with calm. No, it would just show her, head down, arms folded tightly, being walked off a flight like a criminal. She could already hear the headlines. As she began walking toward the front of the plane, her steps slow and mechanical. Her eyes caught on the Jacobs family. Marcus sat straight-backed, arms crossed. Sophia looked at her, not smug, not cruel, just resolute. Jordan watched with wide, quiet eyes. And Lily, still too young to understand, blinked sleepily as her mother adjusted her jacket. Olivia met Marcus's gaze briefly, searching for something, recognition, forgiveness, anything. But he looked away, and that hurt more than anything else, because Olivia wasn't a monster. At least, she hadn't thought she was. She had made a horrible mistake, a devastating one. But it wasn't born out of hatred. It was born out of years of unchecked assumptions, quiet biases, and the unchallenged belief that she always knew best. She had never meant to humiliate anyone. She had just acted quickly, confidently, and completely wrong. As she stepped off the plane, the air from the jet bridge hit her like a wall, cold and sterile. The terminal was busy as always, but the news had already spread. Passengers waiting to board looked up, some whispering, some filming, others simply staring. She heard a few murmurs float through the air. "That's the one. I saw the clip." She got fired mid-flight. And then came the moment of finality. Just beyond the gate, near the rows of chairs and waiting passengers, stood Marcus Bryant, Director of Passenger Relations. He didn't smile. He didn't extend a hand. His voice was professional but firm. "Miss Shaw," he said, "as of this moment, you are officially terminated from your position with this airline." The words hit harder than expected. Even though she had known, hearing them spoken aloud, in public, in front of cameras and strangers, shattered the last bit of pride she had held on to. She nodded stiffly, her face burning. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together. "I understand," she said quietly. Security flanked her now, not with hostility, but with procedure. A formality. But every step through the terminal felt like a walk of shame. Passengers pointed, a few clapped, others just stared. their expressions unreadable. And Olivia, once the respected senior attendant with perfect reviews and polished smiles, now walked like someone being erased. What made it worse, what turned the knife, was the fact that she had just been awarded Employee of the Quarter 3 weeks earlier. She had the certificate still pinned to her fridge at home. She had helped a disabled veteran off a turbulent flight. She had brought tissues to a woman who sobbed quietly for an entire trip without asking why. She had taught new attendants how to handle conflict with grace. She had been good at this, until she wasn't. The Jacobs family exited the plane minutes later. They walked with quiet dignity, their heads held high, not out of triumph, but because they had no reason to hang them. Marcus carried both children's bags. Sophia held Lily's hand. Jordan glanced once in Olivia's direction. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Olivia didn't see hatred. She saw something worse, disappointment and understanding. He would remember this, that a person in power had looked at his family and decided they didn't belong. And that was a lesson no child should ever learn so young. So now you, listener, know the truth, not just of what happened, but what it caught on. If you believe people can change, even after they've failed, if you believe justice should not be cruel, but purposeful, if you believe in accountability, but also redemption, comment below. Tell Olivia what she needed to hear before it was too late. Tell the Jacobs family they were seen. Tell the world that dignity is worth standing up for before it's stolen again. Because careers can collapse in seconds, but so can silence. And both leave people in free fall. The internet didn't wait, it never does. By the time Olivia Shaw stepped through the airport doors, her career in ruins, her reputation unraveling, her name was already trending. Not for excellence, not for service, for shame, for injustice. She didn't need to open her phone to know what had happened. She could feel it in the buzz of the terminal, in the way people looked at her. Not curious, not confused, but certain. Certain of who she was, certain of what she had done. A single moment, a single decision, captured on camera from 4 different angles, had become a wildfire, igniting across social media faster than she could breathe. Headlines had already popped up on every major platform. Flight attendant removes black family from seats without checking their tickets. Caught on camera, racial profiling 30,000 feet. Flight 476 sparks nationwide backlash. Her picture, pulled from her employee profile, was everywhere. Next to captions she hadn't written, accusations she couldn't run from, and truth she couldn't deny. Her hands trembled as she finally unlocked her phone. The screen exploded with notifications, hundreds of them. Her name, once a simple line on a badge, had become a target. She opened Twitter, no, X, they called it now, and there it was. The clip, the moment. Frozen in time, her standing over the Jacobs family, stern, dismissive. Sophia's calm confusion, Marcus holding up the tickets, the children watching. Then cut to her being escorted off the plane, her face blank, her posture stiff. The caption read, "She thought no one would say anything, but someone did." Hashtag Flight 476 had accountability. It had over 3.4 million views and rising. The comments were brutal. This is why we record everything. You can see the arrogance on her face. How many families has she done this to before? Good. Let her lose sleep the way that her family probably did. Fire her, ban her, make an example out of her. Olivia read each one as if they were chiseled into her skin. She wanted to scream, to shout that she wasn't a monster, that it wasn't intentional, that she had made a horrible mistake. But she knew it didn't matter, because this wasn't about what she meant. It was about what she did, and worse, what she represented. The story had moved beyond her. She wasn't Olivia Shaw, the woman. She was Olivia Shaw, the symbol of every time a person was dismissed without cause, of every moment someone's worth was measured by their appearance instead of their humanity, of every time a black family was told to move, to wait, to prove they belonged in a space they had already paid for. She had become the face of a system so many were already tired of fighting, and maybe she deserved it. But she was still human. Her inbox overflowed, not just with news alerts, but messages, some cruel, others heartbreaking. One from a former trainee, "I used to look up to you. I can't believe this is who you are." Another from someone she didn't even know, "You're everything wrong with this industry." But then came one that shattered her completely, a voice message from her mother. "Olivia, I saw the news," her mother said, her voice strained with grief. "Please tell me it's not true. Please tell me you didn't really do this. I don't know what to say. Call me if you can." She couldn't. She wouldn't. Not yet. Her world, once structured and steady, was gone. The routine that had once comforted her, the early morning briefings, the clipped heels on jet bridges, the coffee with fellow crew before boarding, vanished like vapor. No airline would hire her now. She had become radioactive, untouchable. Not because of one mistake, but because the world had decided her mistake wasn't isolated. It was endemic. It was proof of a deeper sickness, and that sickness had a name. Her name. She sat on a cold bench near the rental car counter, clutching her phone like a lifeline, scrolling endlessly as if punishing herself would make it right. Each tweet, each post, each angry thread chipped away at her. And yet, beneath the rage, there was something else, something raw, real. "I flew with my dad once. Same thing happened. No one spoke up. Watching that little boy watch his parents get moved, God, I felt that. This wasn't just about seats. It never is." And that's when it truly hit her. She hadn't just removed a family from their seats. She had shown a child that dignity could be taken away without warning. She had reminded an entire community of something they never forget, that their place in the world is always subject to someone else's comfort. Tears welled up, but she wiped them away before anyone could see. This wasn't the time to cry. This was the time to listen, to own it. She took a breath, then opened the Notes app. Her fingers hovered above the screen. Should she say something? What could she possibly say? If you're listening now and you made it this far, pause. Think. Have you ever made a decision you thought was right in the moment, only to realize later how deeply wrong it was? Have you ever judged someone without knowing it until it was too late? Have you ever looked back at who you were and realized you'd become someone you never intended to be? If so, maybe you understand Olivia. She's not asking for pity, but maybe, just maybe, she's asking for something else. Understanding. So if you believe people should be held accountable, but not erased, if you believe the Jacobs family deserve justice and that Olivia deserves the chance to learn, if you believe in second chances, but only after the truth is faced, like this story, not for Olivia's sake alone, but to show the world that justice matters, yes, but so does growth. And growth, it starts right here, with you. It had been 6 weeks since the flight, since Olivia Shaw's world unraveled at 30,000 feet. In those first days, everything she had built collapsed around her with crushing speed. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons, and her face became a symbol of a much deeper issue. The airline cut ties with her. Job applications went unanswered. Friends she once laughed with at crew briefings slowly stopped replying. It felt like the world had passed judgment, issued a sentence, and walked away, leaving her alone to carry the weight. At first, Olivia couldn't look in the mirror without feeling that shame rise up like a wave. But something surprising happened when the noise started to die down. In the quiet, after the tweets, the headlines, the recordings, and the fallout, there was space. And in that space, something began to grow. She didn't run, she didn't try to hide. Olivia faced it all. She watched the videos. She read the comments. She listened to the anger, the disappointment, the heartbreak in the voices of strangers. And then when her instincts screamed to defend herself, she didn't. Instead, she asked a question she had avoided her entire life. Why did I do what I did? The answer wasn't easy. It was layered. It was painful. But it was honest. It wasn't just about one family or one flight. It was about years of unconscious assumptions, about who belonged where, about how power operated, about who had the right to question her decisions. It was about the system she had existed within and the parts of that system she had upheld, even without realizing it. So Olivia did something she never expected. She started over. Not with a new airline, not with a public relations strategy, but with herself. She signed up for an implicit bias workshop, then another. She attended community forums. She volunteered at a nonprofit that supported families who had experienced discrimination in travel. At first, she just listened. She didn't speak. What could she say? But over time, she began to share her story, not to justify, but to reveal, to offer transparency. And the more she talked, the more she heard the same thing echoed back. Thank you for not running. Thank you for learning. And the most unexpected part, some people forgave her. Slowly, quietly, but genuinely. It didn't fix everything. Some damage can't be undone. She knew the Jacobs family might never know the full journey she took, the work she put in to unlearn what she had once believed was simply policy. But she hoped they felt in some small way the ripple of what their courage had sparked. And one day the ripple came full circle. Olivia was invited to speak on a panel at a community forum, Repairing Trust in Customer Service. And when she walked onto that small stage in a local library, her hands trembled. She thought no one would come. But they did, dozens of people. Some who had been hurt before. Some who had remained silent and now regretted it. Some who were there to listen, and others who were there to learn. And as Olivia stood before them, she didn't read a prepared statement. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She told the truth. I made a mistake that hurt a family deeply, she said. I acted on a bias I didn't even know I carried. And I lost everything because of it. But I also found something in that loss: accountability, humility, and the chance to grow. When the event ended, people came up to her not with judgment, but with gratitude. One woman hugged her and whispered, I've been waiting for someone to admit it like you just did. Thank you. Another man said, we don't just need better training. We need what you did, which you did, owning it. It wasn't fame. It wasn't vindication. It was healing. And that, more than her old title, her old uniform, or her lost job, meant something. So if you're listening to this now and wondering what the lesson really is, it's this. We all make mistakes, some big, some quiet, some that hurt others in ways we don't even see at first. But the size of the mistake doesn't define you. What you do after it does. Do you run or do you take responsibility? Do you stay silent or do you learn to listen? Do you blame the world or do you look inward even when it hurts? Olivia's story reminds us that accountability isn't the end. It can be the beginning if you let it be. We don't grow by pretending we've always been right. We grow by admitting when we've been wrong and choosing actively, courageously to do better. And for anyone who's ever been hurt, who's ever been judged, displaced, or made to feel like they didn't belong, you deserve more than silence. You deserve voices that speak up, systems that change, and people who reflect deeply when they get it wrong. So here's what you can do right now. Like this video if you believe people can learn and grow even after they have fallen. Comment below to share your support for those who've chosen the hard road of accountability. Whether it's Olivia, the Jacobs family, or someone in your own life, encourage them. Remind them that growth is possible. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the human truth behind headlines. We share moments that matter, stories that hold us accountable, but also show us the power of redemption. Because in the end, this isn't just Olivia's story, it's our story, a story about how we fall and how, if we're willing to face the truth, we rise.